Chapter 23, Question 1. Explain the origins of fascism. What is it, and how is it a product of its time? Who in society benefited from fascism? Fascism emerged towards the end of the 19th century as a response to the socio-economic upheaval that was itself a product of the Industrial Revolution. The revolutions of 1848 were a series of widespread, mostly unsuccessful uprisings across Europe that called for political reform, national unity, and social change. The revolutions pitted conservatives, representing the interests of the traditional aristocratic institutions, against liberals and radicals, representing, respectively, the interests of the middle class and working class. At first glance, the failures of the revolutions of 1848 to bring about socio-economic change would appear to be a victory for the aristocratic classes. In the decades that followed, however, a more powerful force than social agitation would render traditional aristocratic privilege irrelevant: economics. The fundamentals of the industrial economy caused two seismic shifts: the elevation of the non-aristocratic ownership class, let's call them the middle class, and the increasingly oppressive subordination of the laboring class, let's call them the working class. In this reconfiguration, class distinction was stripped of the albeit questionable logic of aristocratic privilege, and was instead replaced by a binary have or have not. By the end of the 19th century, political and economic power had shifted to the liberal middle class, but the gap between the socioeconomic elites and the laboring masses only widened. The economic elitism of capitalism appeared to have abandoned the laboring classes, and the political agitation of Marxist socialist groups was seen by some as anarchic. Fascism developed as a response to the machinations of unrestrained capitalism and the perceived wantonness of socialism. The socioeconomic reality at the end of the 19th century seemed to portend a permanent exclusion of the masses from political and economic participation, and fascism was presented as a means to liberate the common man from the illusion of liberal democracy. The devastation of World War I presented fascist ideologues with, as they argued, damning evidence of the corruption of liberal capitalism. Though fascism and socialism were both populist ideologies, socialism was viewed by fascists as chaotic and despotic. The fascist elevation of the state as the guarantor of popular happiness through strength and control was ultimately possible because in times of fear and uncertainty, a strong hand can seem appealing. The hypocrisy of fascism was that this diversion of power from economic elites, and likewise the rejection of socialist calls for greater mass empowerment, did not correspond to an increase of political significance on the part of the working class. Ultimately, fascism was not a populist ideology, but rather a reconfigured feudalism where hereditary title was replaced with party membership and the king was replaced by the supreme leader. The benefits of fascism were largely enjoyed by the party oligarchy and economic elites viewed as sufficiently docile and deferential. Question 2. How does the emergence of the Cristeros demonstrate the complicated nature of post-revolutionary Mexico? Despite not having ascribed to any specific revolutionary model, many of the leading intellectual figures of the Mexican Revolution of 1917 supported socialist-leaning policies. Proposals for the secularization of society and education were met with strong opposition from the Catholic Church and the clergy. As has typically been the case historically, the Catholic Church tended to have stronger support in rural areas among the poor agricultural laboring class. The Catholic Church was able to parlay this devotion into political power, and in the 1920s, a conservative peasant movement backed by the Catholic Church erupted in central Mexico. These pro-clerical peasants would be known as the Cristeros. The Mexican post-revolutionary governments were, in theory, proposing policies that would benefit the laboring masses at the expense of the social elites. There was precedent, however, for peasant support of social elites. Wealthy individuals from the landowning classes had at times, throughout the century since achieving independence from Spain, commanded the loyalty of the peasant class. These caudillos were able to position themselves as defenders of regional priorities against centralized intrusion. The interests of the Catholic Church and the caudillos were both threatened by the secularization and centralization of the Mexican state. Their combined influence among the peasant classes explains the rise of Cristeros who fought against policy that would ultimately benefit them. Question 3. In what ways were the beginnings of the Russian Revolution a repetition of previous outbreaks of unrest? What would be different about the events of 1917? To properly understand the impact of World War I on the Russian Revolution, we need to first examine Russian military fortunes as they unfolded across the 19th century and early 20th century. Russia had played a secondary but crucial role in the defeat of Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. Though his 1812 invasion inflicted heavy losses on the Russians, Napoleon had miscalculated the stress that his rapid advance had placed on his supply lines. The French were fundamentally unprepared for the harsh Russian winter, and in December 1812 began their retreat from Russia. The losses suffered during the retreat from Russia would permanently hobble Napoleon, and would lead directly to his defeat at Waterloo in 1815 and subsequent exile to a barren rock in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. Napoleon's defeat in Russia was predominantly caused by his insufficient provisioning and maintenance of his supply lines. The Russian winter is often given more credit than it deserves, but certainly served to expose and exacerbate the French weaknesses. This fortuitous turn of events misrepresented the Russian contributions to Napoleon's defeat. A place at the table at the 1815 Congress of Vienna convinced the Russians that they were now a legitimate contender for power in Europe. Nothing could be further from the truth, however. The Russian military had been effective in a limited fashion during the Napoleonic Wars, but even their moderate success misrepresented their strength as a state. Russia was not an industrial power, despite having fielded a gunpowder military. The reforms of Peter the Great had focused exclusively on modernizing the military, to the neglect of other parts of the Russian economy. Though Russia could feign military strength, its lack of industrialization meant that it lacked an economy capable of sustained competition against the West. In the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856, the Russians suffered a humiliating loss to a combined British-French Ottoman force. The resulting uproar amongst both the upper and lower classes prompted a wave of reforms meant to modernize the Russian state and economy. These reforms were limited in some cases and regressive in others, so that by the time of the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, the Russians were little better off than they had been coming out of the Crimean War. Significantly, however, the reforms of the late 19th century did have an objective of creating a trained class of professionals, and also sought to grant some degree of local responsibility. The Russo-Japanese War was the second military humiliation in 50 years, and this one was at the hands of a non-European power, no less, and prompted even more intense calls for reform. The second military humiliation in 50 years, this one at the hands of a non-European power, no less, prompted even more intense calls for reform, fueled by the increasingly politically savvy, educated class that had ironically been the product of the last round of reforms. Again, the second round of reforms was limited, and it didn't take long for the Tsar to revert to previous levels of autocracy. Such was the scale of the devastation of World War I, however, that the tenor of the protest now posed an existential threat to the monarchy. The crucial difference between World War I and the conflicts that had preceded it was that in 1917, the armed forces joined in the dissent, and absent their support, the Tsar was forced to abdicate. Question 4. What form did the new revolutionary government take? Why was it unsuccessful? For 8 months after the Tsar's abdication, Russia was ruled by a liberal provisional government under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky. This moderate government sought to establish traditional Western-style political freedoms, including parliamentary rule, social and religious freedoms, and an array of other socio-political reforms. Russia did not have as large or established a middle class as Western states, and the lateness of their disestablishment of serfdom meant that the Russian populace was not inherently inclined to prefer liberal democratic reforms. Anti-monarchism did not necessarily translate into enthusiasm for Western-style parliamentary democracy. The death toll and loss of territory as a result of World War I were just as significant, if not more so, in the fall of the Romanovs as had been any ideological impulse. The decision of the Kerensky government to stay in the war, thus earning the recognition and support of the Western powers it was so desperate to imitate, would provide fuel for the Bolshevik opposition. Continued losses in the war during the summer of 1917 would eventually provide the opening for the Bolsheviks to oust Kerensky and establish their own Marxist-style state. One of their first acts was to sue for peace, something the Kerensky government probably should have done upon the fall of the Tsar. Question 5. Describe the impact of World War I and the November Revolution on Russia's territorial holdings. What long-term effects might this have had on Russia's foreign policy moving forward? Russia had suffered extensive territorial losses at the hands of the Germans before and during the liberal period of control. Having seized power the previous November, in March of 1918, the Bolsheviks formalized the loss of that territory in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Russia was now out of World War I, but at the cost of 25% of its population and 90% of its coal mines. Germany would capitulate mere months after signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The triumphant Western powers would freeze Russia out of the Paris Peace Conference on 3 grounds. The conference had an ostensibly anti-imperialist agenda, though only in relation to the European empires of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. The Western powers felt betrayed by the Bolshevik withdrawal from the war at such a critical juncture, and the capitalist democracies were deeply distrustful of the Marxist-socialist goals of the Bolsheviks. Thus, from the very beginning, the Soviet Union was in a reduced state. Recovering and growing the lost territory and prestige would be of paramount priority to the Soviets, and is the primary motivation behind the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe after World War II. Question 6. Why were the new economic policy and the creation of the Federal Republic of Soviets necessary steps in the early years of the USSR? The Russian Civil War of 1917 to 1922 meant that Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks would have to forestall any full-scale implementation of a Marxist-Leninist state. As the Bolsheviks asserted control towards the end of the Civil War, Lenin issued his new economic policy, which promised entrepreneurial freedom for peasant landowners and small businesses. State interference was limited in scope, and individual initiative was encouraged. The new economic policy allowed the Russian economy to slowly recover until such time as it could sustain a transition to a full communist-style command economy. The Bolshevik revolutionary rhetoric had been effusive in its rejection of Western capitalist imperialism, but still wanted to retain areas of the Tsarist Empire still in their possession after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. To this end, they set up an alliance of republics, each ostensibly independent. The reality, though, was that each republic was governed by a communist party which was completely beholden to the Central Party in Moscow. The Soviets could justify their maintenance of the Russian Empire under the pretense of furthering the cause of global communism. Question 7. How did the fallout from the Treaty of Versailles affect the revolutionary turmoil in China? The end of the Qing dynasty, and with it the Chinese imperial order that had lasted for millennia, heralded decades of sustained political and military instability. Contenders for control of this now untethered state included regional warlords, politically centrist Western-oriented alliances of students, middle-class politicians, and secret societies, and, increasingly, communist ideologues. Japan was an ally of Britain as a result of a 1902 treaty, and immediately entered World War I on the side of the Western Allies. Japan would alarm its allies, however, when it moved rapidly to seize German-controlled territories in East Asia. Most significantly was its occupation of Germans' concessionary areas in China. At the Paris Peace Conference, the Japanese were able to convince the Western powers to formalize Japanese control of those areas it had occupied in China. China had also been an ally of the Western powers, and felt betrayed by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Out of a generalized anti-Western, anti-Japanese sentiment grew a true sense of Chinese nationalism. From this point on, association with or deference to the outside world would be a political liability, one that would be capitalized upon by the growing communist movement. Question 8. How did the priorities of the Kuomintang and the Communists differ, and how might this have affected the long-term success of each? The Revolution of 1911 was followed by a period of instability during which a succession of groups tried to assert themselves as the legitimate central government of China. The state apparatus was in such array, however, that control of China actually rested in the hands of various regional warlords. The Kuomintang, or Nationalists, grew out of a consolidation of the revolutionary forces that had overthrown the Qing. A slow process of forging alliances with key social groups allowed the KMT to accumulate enough power to eventually face the warlord menace. The Nationalists called for a national ideology that would counter foreign intrusion while at the same time introducing reform programs that would alleviate the deprivations of rural peasants and urban laborers. As they consolidated their power, however, they prioritized dealings with the industrial powers over the needs of the Chinese people. Not a popular idea at all, considering the nationalism that had taken root after the Treaty of Versailles. Kuomintang neglect of the rural peasantry had disastrous consequences. Long periods of neglect, compounded by predatory landlords, had reduced the peasantry to a state of abject misery, and disease and famine were widespread in the Chinese countryside. Once the nationalists, headed by Chiang Kai-shek, had suppressed the warlord threat, they turned on their erstwhile communist allies. A series of brutal attacks eventually forced a greatly diminished Chinese Communist Party to flee to rural northwestern China in what would become known as the Long March. Mao Zedong and the Communists, despite their dire situation, would be saved by a combination of two factors. The invasion of the Japanese in 1937 meant that the nationalists found themselves, at various times, either allied with the Communists against the Japanese or fighting a two-front war against both. Though the nationalists had cultivated close relationships with Western powers, they had not developed a popular base amongst the Chinese peasantry. Mao, on the other hand, had early on recognized the value of the peasantry as a vehicle for political and military success. While the nationalists were contemptuous of the rural peasantry, the nationalist destruction of the Huayuankuo Dam in 1938 resulted in the deaths of upwards of 900,000 Chinese citizens. Mao and the Communists were careful to cultivate a following amongst the rural peasantry, providing critical services at the same time as the nationalists were stripping their own people of food and resources. World War II ended with the defeat of the Japanese, but the Nationalist Party was left crippled without any popular base from which it could mount an offensive against the Communists. Mao's mutual affection for the rural peasantry would inform his formulation and implementation of Marxist doctrine and would be the backbone of his power base until his death. Question 9. Why did the Great Depression happen? How would this contribute to the political precursors to World War II? Several factors contributed to the economic instability leading up to the Great Depression, none more significantly than overproduction. Food production had soared in response to World War I demand. This high demand naturally produced inflation, encouraging farmers to grow more. Emboldened by the increases in price, farmers in the Western world, and especially in the United States, borrowed heavily to mechanize and expand their production. Increased production increased the supply, which resulted in a dramatic decrease in prices. The initial increase in demand, and thus price, had in part been caused by the disruption of the global imperial economy. In the years after World War I, the colonies, with agricultural production their sole source of income, had to increase production to offset the falling prices. The overall result was a catastrophic drop in the price of agricultural goods. In a general sense, the global agricultural sector was a key market for the sale of industrially produced goods. The drop in food prices meant that agricultural producers were no longer able to purchase these goods, and thus manufacturing sectors stalled. Most significantly, however, was that banks throughout the Western world, but most crucially in the United States, had lent freely during the inflationary period. The struggles of the agricultural and manufacturing sectors now began to affect the banking sector, as borrowers began to default on their loans. As the economic conditions became more dire, the United States made the fateful decision to enact the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922. This was a law that raised tariffs on imported goods to protect American industries and farmers in the face of these deteriorating markets. It set some of the highest tariff rates ever employed by the United States. By raising tariffs, The law made it harder for European countries to sell their goods to the United States and limited their ability to earn cash with which they could pay off their war debts, much of which, ironically, was carried by the United States. In response to Ford v. Macomber, many countries imposed their own tariffs, which froze international trade. These protectionist policies paralyzed the global economy at a time when more, not less, purchasing was needed. The specific economic conditions in the United States were the catalyst for the Great Depression. Despite having the world's largest economy, the U.S. had very little regulation of its financial sector. There were few safeguards in place to prevent overlending and borrowing on margin. The post-war boom produced a surge of irrational exuberance, with banks, corporations, and private individuals investing heavily in a stock market whose value was wildly overrated. These weak underlying fundamentals were exposed by the retaliatory tariffs. U.S. exports dropped precipitously after World War I, and though the numbers fluctuated throughout the 1920s, by the end of the decade, U.S. exports sat at approximately 70% of that at the beginning of the decade. Investor confidence had not adjusted, however, and in the absence of sufficient government oversight, banking institutions had overextended themselves. When the stock market crashed, the previously obscured weaknesses were laid bare. The 1930 Hawley-Smoot tariff severed any significant connection between the U.S. economy to the global economy, which was the exact opposite of what was needed. The material, economic, and human devastation of World War I had drastically reduced quality of life across Europe. In Germany, the stark contrast between the prosperity of the late 19th and early 20th centuries and the deprivations of the 1920s was particularly jarring. The conditions in Germany were profoundly worsened by the penalties imposed under the Treaty of Versailles. Post-war reparations payments severely damaged the German economy, leading to hyperinflation, social unrest, and dependence on U.S. loans. Though the Dawes and Young plans brought temporary stability, the economic strain left Germany vulnerable to crisis and political extremism. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the U.S. withdrew its support of the German economy, which consequently imploded for the second time at the end of the 1920s. The role that foreign powers had played in Germany's misfortunes was not lost on a desperate German populace, and Hitler and the Nazis were able to capitalize on this nationalist resentment in their rise to power. Question 10. How did the Great Depression intensify the militarization of the Japanese Empire? Militarization had always been a part of the vision put forth by the architects of the Meiji Restoration. This generation of leaders had seized power from the tottering Tokugawa shogunate in direct response to increasing intrusion of Western powers into Japanese affairs. The Tokugawa regime was not seen as being capable of achieving autarky, the state of political and economic independence. The model the Meiji seized on was that of the most powerful nations on earth, industrialized imperialism. The Meiji first recognized that outright military resistance would not be successful. They had seen the consequences of such a policy in the humiliating defeats of China at the hands of Western powers in the First and Second Opium Wars. Instead, the Meiji sought to gradually modernize, but within the constraints of the accepted global order. The Japanese eventually gained equal status with the Western powers and immediately embarked on a plan of imperial expansion on the Asian mainland. Western states had achieved autarky in much the same way. Japan slowly made territorial gains on the Asian mainland, which necessarily involved a degree of military involvement. The deliberate growth of the Japanese empire relied upon, however, imports of raw materials until such time as they had acquired territory sufficient for autarky. The deteriorating global economic conditions throughout the 1920s placed increasing pressure on the Meiji plan. The tariff wars sparked by the U.S. made the importing of raw materials unaffordable, and so the Japanese sped up their plan of imperialization with the occupation of Manchuria in 1931, which in itself did not initiate intense militarization. The unexpected resistance of the Chinese provoked a costly war that saw the conversion of the Japanese state into a total war machine. From this point on, the only means of achieving autarky was total victory, which set Japan on a collision course with the other great power in the Pacific, the United States. Question 11. How did communism save the Soviet Union during the Great Depression? What key political and economic developments occurred in the USSR during this period? The Soviet Union had been isolated from the global economic and political order from its inception. As a consequence, the Soviets had to develop a self-sufficient economy that did not rely on participation in global markets. Under normal circumstances, this would have hurt the Soviet economy, but when the global economy imploded in the 1930s, they were insulated by their separateness. Soviet leaders trumpeted their ongoing industrial growth, even as Western economies collapsed. The Soviet Union's relative economic success was paired, however, with a tightening of the communist system. Joseph Stalin, who had seized leadership of the state after the death of Lenin, had parallel goals to fully industrialize the Soviet economy, but to do so under the complete supervision of the state. Stalin achieved both goals. The Soviet Union was able to grow its industrial capacity so much during the 1930s that it was narrowly able to resist a German invasion in 1941 and would subsequently drive the Germans halfway across Europe. Stalin did this while also increasing his totalitarian grip on Soviet society.